I've only been here in San Antonio for less than 24 hours. It's getting to be about 24 hours. And I have seen actually two parts of San Antonio. One is the well-known, the famous San Antonio, the San Antonio of the Riverwalk and the really wonderful downtown which you have, which is as good as any in the United States. There are no better downtowns than this one. And it is a downtown that is not just now beginning to get better, but in fact there have been, as far as I can tell, several generations of planners making excellent decisions, and you can see the results. That is the San Antonio which is well known to planners outside, not just to tourists, but to planners. There is another San Antonio outside of that area, which is identical to the mess that is occurring in most other cities. It's the pattern of suburban sprawl. That is the San Antonio which no one takes you to visit and is unremarkable in every way. And it is in fact the pattern of growth that will make this place ultimately choke as surely as other cities have choked that have followed this pattern. By choke I mean the inability to sustain growth. Now I come from a city that is an excellent laboratory. I mean, I intimately know Miami and the history of planning in Miami and what has happened. This is the headline that we received on Monday, October the 2nd, 1989, that announced that Miami could grow no further. That this was it. There was a comprehensive planning act that the state of Florida promulgated that said growth would not be permitted if it were not concurrent with the provision of infrastructure, which is to say roads and schools. And since Miami, or Dade County, like almost every other American city, no longer has the money to build the infrastructure, it closed down growth. What has been happening all over areas like Dade County, or the areas outside of Washington, D.C., or the area around Boston and Cape Cod, or around Los Angeles, or around Sacramento, is that growth is shutting down. Developers are not welcome. Now that's a remarkable situation because throughout our history we have as a society welcomed growth that has always been positive. You know, the tax base, people, jobs, economic well-being, all of these things come from growth. And it's absolutely remarkable when you get into a position where you no longer want growth, when the citizens will actually come out and say no more. Well, that's being achieved all over the United States. There is the idea that somehow if growth were better planned, it would all come out right. That is not the case, because there's an awful lot of good planning that has been going on in the Sun Belt. For example, this is a community somewhere in the Southwest, a so-called planned community, which you can see is the kind of place that planners with codes this thick have been zealously administering. We have these, when we have had these in Dade County and around Orlando for 20 years. But in fact, growth has choked just as if there had been no planning. The problem is not that growth itself is bad, but that the pattern of growth, if this is the pattern of growth which is selected, it cannot be sustained in the long term. And it will close down, in fact, your system, and it will close down your development community. What does this pattern consist of? The pattern is, which I'm going to call throughout this talk today, suburban sprawl, is an extremely simple organism. It consists of just 4 components. It consists of housing clusters, like this one. It consists of shopping centers, like this one. Of office parks, like this one. And it consists of the meeting places that we have, our schools, and post offices and city halls and so forth, like this one, which are usually assembled at the end of a collector street in something called a pod. To remind you of 2 examples in San Antonio, I believe it's called the University of Texas at San Antonio, is in fact in one of these pod conditions. And there is also that medical complex in that northwestern direction. What's it called? that medical center is also one of these pod situations. And I am told by the city traffic engineer that that is where traffic is worse, in fact. Well, that's typical of the situation. When you put elements like these at single-use elements at the ends of collector streets, ultimately what chokes growth is traffic. It cannot be sustained. Now, the interesting thing about these four elements is that all four are necessary for life. I mean, what we're talking about here is places where people live, places where people shop, places where people work, and places where people gather. It is the humans need this for their habitat. How is it that these humans that need these places are actually get to the position that they're against growth? You know, how do you arrive at that condition? Well, we've analyzed it. And what we found, by speaking to people, not a big study, we're not the Gallup organization, but when you speak to people who live in the suburbs, you find two contradictory, I think, opinions. One is that they like where they live. They like their house and they like their lot, but they don't want any more of it. Now, when you delve further, what you find is that they actually like their private realm. They very much like what the developers have provided them in terms of interiors, bathrooms, square footage, heating, air conditioning, washing machines, appliances, convenience of parking, and so forth. They also like their country clubs. They like their golf courses. What they don't like is the public realm. As soon as they step out of their front yard, they enter a situation which is essentially harsh, stressful, and ugly. The public realm is tough to be in the suburbs. This is as opposed to the public realm that you have here in downtown San Antonio. The great success of downtown San Antonio is not the specific hotels, you know, the Marriott or this or that shopping, because you can find that in the suburbs. The great success is that it's a great public realm. The streets and the squares are beautifully designed for people. That is completely the opposite of what's happening in the suburb. The public realm is a rough place to be. That is what they don't want. Now, what we're proposing as a pattern here is to build in the suburbs with a public realm which is of that same quality, a public realm which is as good to be in as the one that you have downtown. And I'm going to specify exactly how this is done. And at this point, this presentation gets quite technical. These are two places in Virginia, not too far from each other. This one's called Virginia Beach. That one is called Alexandria. They're both flattering photographs, believe it or not. This one comes from the promotional brochure of the city of Virginia Beach. When you go there, they give you this. They say, becoming a showcase, Virginia Beach Boulevard Phase 1 celebrated its opening. Now, what's happening here is that this is what the plan of Virginia Beach has in mind for this city. This is what they have in mind. You laugh, but this is very similar to what your suburban code has in mind for the surroundings of downtown San Antonio. What you see here is not substantially different than what you see there. This is what the code has in mind. Now, what is this code concerned about? Well, perfectly objectively, the most important thing that this code is concerned about is that cars should be happy. You see? These are happy cars because they never have to stack up more than 6 at a time. They make nice, easy turns. They don't strain their little steering wheels doing that. And they can park even on the worst retail day of the year. That parking lot is rated for the Saturday before Christmas. Now, the fact that, you know, for the rest of the year it is from 1/3 to 2/3 empty, that's irrelevant. It's always maximized, the maximum efficiency. Now, the other thing that this code is terribly concerned about is that the uses not be mixed. It's very, very important to the planners of Virginia Beach that everything here be retail. This is a shopping center or a retail area. The offices are where you work are elsewhere. The residential is elsewhere. Everything that you see here, whether it's big or small, this is a very big mall here, and then there's a tiny little bank and a couple of medium-sized eating places. Everything here is of a single use, which is retail. Now, let's talk about this as an environment. It's not that these planners don't care about people. Obviously, there's a sidewalk code somewhere here. But you know perfectly well from experience that only indigents are to be found in places like that. If you actually see somebody halfway decently dressed walking in that sidewalk, you stop to help them out, because obviously some problem. It is actually, that kind of environment, it is embarrassing to be seen walking, admit it, in a place like this. Only the underclass is found as a pedestrian here. There's a sidewalk, but it's a completely unworkable sidewalk. Now, obviously here, there's also a landscape ordinance, and even a tree preservation ordinance. And it's important to say this, and the signs don't look too bad. You don't see too many signs. It's important to say this because after one generation of this kind of planning, most planners have looked at it and said, this doesn't look so good. Let's pass additional ordinances, for example, that require trees in the parking lot and require berms. But that isn't the issue at all. The problem with this is not that it is ugly. The problem is that it doesn't work. It can't be sustained. And I'm going to show you some beautiful suburban sprawl later on. So don't be confused by sign ordinances, berms, and landscape. Those are fine, but they're only cosmetic. They really don't get at the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is that in the end, this cannot be sustained. Because regardless of the number of lanes that are built, there are never enough lanes. What a city needs to decide, a city like yourself, is whether you want traffic congestion is a constant. It's a constant because traffic, and this has been known since the 1950s, traffic will grow to fill capacity. What you need to decide is whether the city of San Antonio would like to have its allotment of traffic congestion at 4 lanes, or whether you would like your traffic congestion at 8 lanes, or your traffic congestion at 12 lanes, or at 24 lanes, or, as is being proposed in Miami, they would like to deliver our traffic congestion at 44 lanes, which is what I-95 has to be. But traffic congestion is a constant, and it is not solved, and never has been solved, and cannot be solved by the building of highways. It is solved by mixed-use planning. What you do is you eliminate trips or you shorten trips. You do not build highways, because as soon as you build highways, people use them. Technically what happens is that as long as traffic flows, people make basically idiotic decisions about where they live relative to where they work. They will, if it is only 20 minutes to get from the workplace to the house that I like, I will buy that house because it has skylights over the bathroom, or because, you know, it's $2 less per square foot or whatever, rather than factoring in that 20 minutes is a large part of my life. And besides, that 20 minutes turns into 40 minutes and then turns into an hour and then into an hour and a half commute. When you have friction in traffic, people factor in that additional information, how far am I from work? And that is ultimately the solution, or at least the stabilization of the traffic problem. Now take the alternate system here. This is Old Town Alexandria. It is it was laid out by George Washington's father. And George Washington was active here, administering the code and so forth. And the curious thing about this is that whenever I show it, people think that it is a form of Williamsburg, that somehow to live in a place like that, you need to wear costumes or be government subsidized or put up with incredible inconvenience or something or other, you know, have outhouses instead of toilets. But in fact, these are very real people living, working, and shopping here, people with kids and jobs and everything. Let me describe how different this is from this, because it's backwards in almost every way. If you look at this area here, all the buildings here, what they have in common is that they're small. What they don't have in common is that they're a single use. See, over here you have houses, you have boarding houses, you have bed and breakfast inns, you have corner stores, you have medical practitioners, you have architects and lawyers in operation, but you even have churches. What they have in common is that the buildings are all small. Therefore, they are compatible. This is completely different from the kind of coding that occurs here, in which the buildings can be large or small, but they're a single use. Over in this area, there are buildings that are medium-sized, and then buildings that are very large. You see, it's small buildings with small buildings, large buildings with large buildings. All of these things are compatible as long as the sizes are similar. So, do you see, the codes are written completely differently. The code that makes this place worries about how building, or is concerned about how buildings behave in terms of physical size and disposition relative to the street. As long as the buildings are pulled up to the street and they're not over a certain size, they're compatible. As opposed to this, that cares very little about that. Well, that's the private realm. That's how the private realm works here. Now, the public realm is also different. These streets here are all small and they're all complex. Traffic flows slowly in them. This street is a very simple street. It's really a highway. It's a very simple street. Only one thing happens here. The only thing that happens here is that cars flow. Pedestrians don't, trees don't exist, buildings don't align this street. It's only for cars. The public realm is only for cars in this model. Here, the public realm contains not only cars that move, but cars that park, trees on the sidewalks, and buildings. It's a public realm which is, because it's complex, is friendly to both cars and pedestrians. How is this achieved? It's achieved because it's a network of streets, you see. There are many, many different ways of getting from anywhere to anywhere else. As a result of that, no one street has to be large. This system, which is a system of collector streets, has very few streets that are active because the pods feed into collectors and the collectors feed onto highways. So all of these have to be very large because very few streets are actually through streets. That's how you can get an entirely different, that's how you can get the sort of the miraculous feel of traffic flowing slowly and being friendly to pedestrians, because there are many, many different ways to do it. These are some of the images that you find in Alexandria. Notice that this corner store is approximately the same in size as the townhouses, therefore it is compatible. If it were a shopping center, it would be a problem. If it were a 7-Eleven with the parking in front, it would be a problem. But this is perfectly compatible. And I have dozens and dozens and dozens of retail components like this in the middle of neighborhoods that, instead of being considered a blight, are actually considered everybody's favorite gathering place. It's a social center. This is a lawyer's office, which, as you can see, is perfectly compatible to the housing on either side. Now, I could give an entire description of this. I could show you apartment buildings that are compatible, all sorts of buildings. And you've all seen them. You know what this is like. But it demonstrates the issue of physical compatibility rather than functional compatibility. Now, an aerial photograph of two town centers, the old model and the new model. These are actually the retail components, the retail portions of the town centers. This is what the Urban Land Institute calls a neighborhood center. It's a precisely described series of stores which contain such things as the bank, the video store, the two inexpensive restaurants, the food store, the hardware. You know, these stores that neighborhoods actually need. They're 30, 35,000 square feet. The problem is not this in itself, because this, in fact, is the neighborhood center for these people. The problem is that the planners, having inherited this mania for separating things, and this being a very advanced code that we have here in Miami, not only separates the uses, but makes damn sure that you can't get from one to the other by requiring a wall and a ditch for good measure, just in case anyone even thinks of walking from one to the other. As a result of this, even the houses that are in 1 minute, within 1 minute walking distance, become automobile commuting situations. Everyone here has to get in the car, drive out to the collector street, use up capacity in the collector, come back here and park here 1 minute from where they started. Now, is this necessary? Is this separation necessary? It is absolutely not necessary. It comes from this mania from the Industrial Revolution, in which the first great victory of the planning profession was to separate the factories from the working places, because people would get unhealthy and get tuberculosis when industry used to pollute. What has happened is that the planning profession has been reliving that victory generation after generation after generation, separating everything from everything else, until finally, in certain advanced places like Orlando or Miami, you have not only separation of industry from houses, you have 27 different categories. Everything is separated from everything else. Medical office buildings are separated from regular office buildings. I mean, it's astonishing, and all of it unnecessary, because American industry at this moment rarely pollutes. Rarely is it noxious. The third world country is taking care. The third world is taking care of that kind of industry now. Generally, we have highly compatible uses. The curious thing about this situation is that, yes, some people don't want to live next to retail. You're right, they don't. But on the other hand, some people do want to live near the town center. This does not give you the choice. This one does. See, here's the retail component. Here's the parking lot, which actually is detailed as a town square. The parking's still in front the way retail needs it. This is the shops. Now, some people get to live up close to the stores if they so wish, but the town grows out, and some people get to live at some distance, and some people get to live far away. There's a choice of what your relationship to the downtown is. In this one, there is no choice. No one can walk to the downtown, even though it can be demonstrated that there are certain elements of our society that would very much welcome being able to walk to their daily needs, including senior citizens and kids. They would welcome that. This does not permit that. The planners forever have decided that this is the way it will be, and nothing else but that. Now, if you look at it from the ground, both of these photographs, I think, are surprising to people when I explain them. This is surprising to people because laymen, not planners, of course, or architects, when people who are not architects or planners or administrators look at this, they really think that when they see a shopping center like this, they think some developer has gotten away with something. You know, surely they know someone because, you know, this slipped by somehow. That's not at all the case. Every detail of this shopping center is precisely according to code, precisely. The number of parking spaces is precise. The size of the parking space, the quality of the paint that paints that there, the thickness of the asphalt, the drainage pattern, and the lighting, all that is specifically designed and determined, and the setback of the building. This is the way that it is because the code, in fact, requires it to be this way. Take a town center like this. Now, what's surprising to me when I see a place like this is that it is pathetically easy to achieve this excellence. Pathetically easy. What is so difficult about this? I mean, these are buildings. These are not expensive buildings. This isn't expensive paving. This isn't brick. That's just asphalt. This is just grass. You know, that isn't some kind of elegant Italian design trash barrel. That's an old thing. These are cars parked right in front. What is so difficult or expensive about this? Nothing. What is surprising is that everything that you see there is illegal according to the code. Everything. You can't live above, first of all, there isn't enough parking, theoretically. Second of all, the setbacks are wrong. Third, you can't live above the store. Fourth, you can't back out on the traffic. On and on and on and on of that. What actually happens in our codes is that the bad is easy and the good is difficult. The developers that come to us to design new towns, in fact, know perfectly well that that's marketable. They know that people prefer that. In fact, they manifest it every day by the way they leave their dollars there rather than here. Per square foot, it's much higher in the traditional towns that have survived. The problem is that they have to put up with the difficulty of 12, 15, 20, 25 variances to achieve this kind of thing, and fighting all the way to do that. Obviously, something is completely backwards. Now let's look at the offices. This is a flattering illustration of a modern office park. This is an existing office situation in Princeton, New Jersey. Now, what you see here, I show this as a rendering because, in fact, the real one is never this good looking, and I'm always trying to flatter it. What you see here is a pedestrian, which in fact is a theoretical possibility, but is actually impossible to, if you know anything about human nature. And it has to do with what's happening to that pedestrian on either side. Okay? On the first side is you can see that it is unpleasant to be there, not only because there's a semi-trailer truck going by, even a car going by at 25 miles an hour poses a perceived danger to a pedestrian. You do not have pedestrian life unless you have a layer of parked cars on the street. Okay? That can be seen anywhere on Earth. Even a place that is that it has as strong a pedestrian environment as Paris, the city of Paris, when Pompidou removed certain layers of parking in the 1960s to have traffic flow, the retail died on the sides. It's only when Giscard restored it that the retail was recovered. You do not have pedestrian life unless there's the layer of metal between you and the moving car. That can be observed anywhere. Now, traffic people hate these parked cars on the street. Because what did they do is they slow up traffic. But to which you say, well, to which the answer is, but that is precisely what is necessary here. This isn't a highway in the countryside. This is going through where buildings are. There are buildings here. There are people here. You can't build a highway. You must build an avenue. You see, and that's the difference. Now, on the other side, this pedestrian is frightened on one side, and on the other side, he's bored. Because what he has on the other side are hood ornaments, like this. That's something that any shopping center developer knows. Any gap between one store and the next store will cause people to turn back and not keep going. You can't gap. Imagine having this continuous gap of a parking lot. I mean, gaps are bad enough in your own downtown where you have them. You know, between frontage and the next frontage, sometimes you still have parking lots. Here, it is absolutely untenable. The least that can happen is that this building should move forward to form something that the pedestrian can look into. Now, this architect can't help it because he's under two restrictions. One is there's a setback for the building, and second of all, there's a very high number of parking spaces required, so there's nothing to do but to put the parking lot in front. In Princeton, New Jersey, what you find is office buildings, you know, with real people there working, real lawyers, you know, real architects, real professionals working there, real insurance companies. But instead of having nothing to do at lunchtime, which is a very low quality of life that you get in these suburban parks, you either have the company cafeteria or you have to get in the car and waste a lot of your time getting to an interesting place. These people come right down and they have a huge choice of restaurants and shops, etc., etc. The parking, of course, is in the back. The reason parking is in the rear is that offices, retail needs some parking in front, but office buildings don't need any parking in front. Because you must go to the office building because you either work there or you have an appointment there. You don't get this shopping by enthusiasm, you know, in which, oh, I see something, let me stop because it's convenient. It's an entirely different type of parking, and in Princeton, the parking takes place to the rear. What you have here is a much higher quality of life for the people who work there, and by the way, they pay for it accordingly. All of these rent for much more than these, and they're rarely vacancies. What about the residential component? Well, this is more subtle than ever, the residential situation. This is in Palm Beach County, where there's lots of landscaping and lakes, and it shows easily that the problem with the suburb is not necessarily that they're ugly. Palm Beach County is beautiful. It's full of landscaping and golf courses. The problem is that it doesn't work, and in a very insidious way, socially. You see, this system of planning by pods has attached to it a segregation by income. Everybody that lives in this pod has paid over $350,000 for their unit. Everybody that lives in this pod has paid about $250 or less for their unit, and everybody that lives in this pod, which is quadruplexes, has paid $100,000 for their unit. What has happened in our suburbs is that for marketing reasons, and which I believe are completely artificial, this element of snobism, which is pushed, which is if you live in here, you're better than everyone else that lives outside. And if you live here, you're better than everyone else. And it sort of pecks on, you know, there's a pecking order all the way down. If you were to offer to build a $250,000 house here on this empty lot, this homeowners association would have a major fit. Because the real estate prices are going up. What has been happening is that people are now have a great fear of anybody who isn't exactly their income. We're not talking about bringing the homeless in, you know, from downtown Palm Beach. It's someone who has $250,000 to buy a house not being permitted to build there. that is completely insidious. The kind of political fragmentation that is taking place in the suburbs, the dislike and suspicion that people have for each other, is making it virtually impossible to govern intelligently. And that's being built into this system, and it's completely unnecessary. Look at the old system, basically the American system. This is Georgetown. On this street, you have apartment buildings on both sides of the street, which is to say quite affordable housing. Over on this street, you have townhouses facing each other, which is to say relatively more expensive housing. Then on this street, you have big houses, which is to say quite expensive housing. And finally, here on this estate, probably one of the great famous fortunes of America, living in splendid quarters, all within a very, very short distance from each other and all sharing the same public realm. This is the way we used to do it. Now, what's interesting, or rather important, about mixed-use planning is that it is not just important to have workplaces and shopping places and living places. It is equally important to have a range of incomes living together. Because if you don't, you have to begin importing people of different incomes to work for each other. A typical situation in Palm Beach County has to send buses to Broward County to pick up workers to come cook hamburgers and mow the lawn. You know, that kind of thing is going on. It's also going on in Cape Cod. In this system, there's the theoretical possibility that the person who mows this lawn can live within walking distance in one of these apartments. And there's another thing that's important. It isn't just important to have the lower economic classes integrated into the upper. It is equally important to have extremely wealthy people distributed among the neighborhoods and villages. That can be seen all over the Midwest and all over the Northwest. There are two types of small towns in America. Those that have one wealthy family and those that don't. The ones who don't have that wealthy family have no culture. They're just dead ends. Those towns that have the good fortune of having had one tycoon, one factory owner, those are the ones that have the beautiful parks and the museums and the cultural activities. It is necessary when you have to have a full society with a cultural component that there be people of wealth and leisure integrated into the rest of society. Because everyone else is working too hard and doesn't have enough money to actually pursue culture. Only the very wealthy can. So it's important to build all of these things together. In Europe, in any city, it's not only in the United States that you find that this is the traditional pattern. In Europe, the great dukes, the popes, and so forth, any European city that you see has the palaces next to very humble artisans' dwellings. All societies have been able to integrate by income. They have not been able to integrate foreigners, necessarily. There are Turkish quarters and there are Jewish quarters in Europe. But by income, yes, because it is necessary and intelligent, in fact, to integrate by income. It is only now that we're inventing this ridiculous system, an unnecessary system of integration. And what do these residential neighborhoods look like from, or neighborhoods to flatter them, what do these residential components look like from the ground? Well, this is the fast food version of the American dream, what we call the McMansion. What is problematic about it is not that there is the house and the lot, because that's fine, that's the American dream. The problem is that it's a cartoon of the American dream, because all you get is the illusion of privacy and the illusion of individuality. If this were assembled into a community, you would get both. You would get your privacy, your individuality, but you would always get the community. See, what these give you, they only give you privacy. They don't give you community. What we're proposing is that these single-family houses and their lots be assembled into neighborhoods, that this be enriched and become a special place. What we found, according to marketing studies, is that people welcome both sides. In fact, currently, in marketing studies, there are two words that are exceptionally important to people. One is security, of course. The other one is community. They're neck and neck with each other in importance. There's another very interesting study completed by Gallup last year, which analyzed people in metropolitan regions, and they asked them where they would prefer to live. And what they responded is that 36% wanted to live in small towns. Only 25% wanted to live in suburbs. So it's not what people think. You see, developers and the ULI and these people think that everyone wants to live in suburbs. That's not true. They want their single-family houses, but they prefer to live in towns, not just suburbs. Who's providing towns? No one. All the developers are like lemmings providing exactly the same product. You know, the pod community with the golf course attached. No wonder it is so drastically overbuilt. Very few people are providing towns. The developers that come to us, in fact, are asking for towns because they see it as an enormous unmet marketing niche. Now, how do you provide affordable housing? Traditional towns give you different strategies. Two are very simple. One of them is, do not permit people to build retail unless there is, in some measure, housing attached to it. Because you see, merchants don't live above the store necessarily because they're doing too well to do that. Anybody who owns a liquor store can afford the American dream of the single-family house. The people who live near or above the store are the clerks and the waiters and the apprentice pharmacists and all sorts of people, in fact, that if they don't live nearby, they have to own cars, which they really can't afford to own because they're not getting paid that much, and they also plug up the parking lot by having to commute there. Why not permit them to live above the store, either in the shopping center pattern or even in the Stop and Shop or whatever your local, I don't know whether it's 7-Eleven or Circle K. This is a convenience store in the very beautiful and delicate town of Sconset in Nantucket. Then instead of being considered a blight, as a 7-Eleven would be, it's considered the corner store, perfectly nice place with the people who work there living above. This is Princeton, New Jersey, Palmer Square, built by a developer as a single shot, administered by a developer as a single shot, extremely profitable retail, and very, very desirable places to live. In fact, one of the great secrets is how many people love to live above the store. There's a development in southern New Jersey that had apartments above the store. They sold 90 of them in 3 days. In Miami Lakes, in Florida, all of the apartments above the stores, which is a new development, are rented. In Hyde Park Village in Tampa, the same thing. The apartments above the store, constantly rented. And the same thing in Reston. The only part of Reston that did well were the apartments above the store in Lake Anne. The other way to provide affordable housing, which is the healthiest possible way to do it, permit backyard cottages, or if you prefer to call them granny flats or garage apartments. You see, this little building, which is here in the back of this house. Now, what is a garage apartment or a granny flat? It's a bedroom that has gravitated from inside the house to become independent so that it can enter the rental market. See, this nation is full of unused bedrooms. There are millions of unused bedrooms all over, which cannot be rented because they would violate the privacy of the family. But if that bedroom were permitted to be separate like this and equipped with a small kitchen, not only could you rent to people at $200 or $300 a month, but that $200 or $300 would supplement the mortgage of the principal owner, which would in turn make it more affordable. And it's the best kind of affordable housing because it is integrated into the middle class, so that middle class norms of behavior are applied. It's not up to the police department to make sure that this person, keeps their stereo low or keeps the car parked in the right place. It's up to the principal landowner to do it. It's a self-policing, it's a privately policed system. This has been around since the very first settlements of America. Williamsburg is full of outbuildings. But now, and all the way till the 20s, the houses all had these. And now they're completely illegal. And planning departments zealously check to make sure that you can't slip in a kitchen anywhere, as if it were going to be the end of the world. What's happening is that people are afraid of lots becoming duplex lots. But that can be easily controlled by maintaining the maximum size to 400 square feet. Because if it's at 400 square feet, only a single person or a couple can live there, and it doesn't get into the children and all that overload that it implies. Outbuildings should not only be made legal, they should be encouraged. Now, 2 rules about how to provide affordable housing so that it doesn't turn into a slum. Rule number 1 is, it's got to look normal. do not experiment on the poor. Architects love to experiment on the poor because the poor are presumed to be grateful to have a roof and a bathroom. And of course the middle class won't put up with it because they'll just go buy something that looks normal, so they experiment on the poor. But the problem is that the poor are already insecure enough about their social situation without looking like an architectural experiment. So they tend to trash the places that look funny. Why not provide affordable housing the way we used to? This is in Annapolis. Here, on this house is one of the great historic houses of Annapolis, a large place with a huge garden. This is a more middle-class house. And right next to them are two 12-foot townhouses, 12 feet. But they look like the rest of the houses. They have decent materials, decent windows, decent door. It's just that they are smaller. Also, it is interspersed with the middle class. And that's the second rule. It is not enough to provide housing that looks normal. It is important that you provide it in very small increments interspersed with market rate housing. This is in St. Louis. St. Louis has undergone 2 generations of experiments in affordable housing. The first one was the high-rises, which of course were demolished in that very famous in the 70s. That was a failed experiment. So then they said, aha, we've learned the lesson. We won't put people in townhouses. We're going to put them in low-rise that looks normal, which they did. Here it is. But this also turned into a slum. The problem is that they put 300 of these in one place. And all it takes is a couple of rotten apples, a couple of people selling drugs, a couple of cars that can't be maintained to have the whole thing degenerate. You can't put housing in large increments. It has to be scattered, even in small increments. I mean, especially in small increments. 2 affordable housing units like this are not going to destroy the real estate value of 10 or 20 houses around them. That's the only way it will survive. Any housing that you build on this pattern is really a wasted investment because it will go under and it will require maintenance and perhaps even demolition. How do you intersperse this housing? Because developers will tell you, well, we can't mix incomes, that'll never work, people don't like living with people of different incomes and so forth. Well, the reason they say that is that this is the pattern that they're thinking about. This is what we call a train wreck. Now, you're welcome, or planners are welcome to do housing as erratic as this one, site planning as erratic, if it weren't for one thing. And that is that these apartment buildings that are spinning wildly on their site are incapable of having a front and a back, the discipline of front and back. And it is that discipline of front and back that permits housing to be mixed. Take this aerial photograph here. This is where I live. This is Coral Gables in Florida, which is the development from the 1920s. It has the highest real estate values in South Florida, the second highest in all of Florida after Palm Beach. It's an open grid to the city. Okay, that has never been a problem, by the way, in expensive neighborhoods. You don't need to gate people off to have security, because all you need to do is make authentic neighborhoods. They take care of themselves. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I want to talk about here is that within a very small geographical distance, which is to say not, in fact, smaller than this pod here, Coral Gables manages to have an avenue that has 16-story office buildings and apartment buildings and hotels on both sides of this street. The next street over has apartment buildings of 2 and 3 stories, which is to say quite affordable housing. And the next street over has expensive single-family houses. How is this achieved? It's achieved because people relate to their front door. It's their address. It's their stoop. It's their street that means something to them. What happens behind them is of very little importance. Okay? That's why you get this. Now, this you normally don't see if you just drive around a city, because what you do is one day you drive down this street and you say, oh, what a nice street, single-family houses. And then, the next day you drive down this one and say, aha, this is the apartment. And the next day you drive here and see something else. Only when you study aerial photographs do you see how often these uses are mixed in a back-to-back situation. Current planners don't do this anymore. They separate uses on the street, like this, which means you get completely asymmetrical conditions, high rises on one side, low rises on the other. That is a direct result of working with magic markers. Magic markers are too fat to do any planning with. It's too crude a tool. It's like a club. Use a pencil, use a pen. Because what you can do with a pen is actually make surgical interventions in terms of how to mix uses. For example, what's happening, the line is actually drawn here. These are duplexes facing each other. In our experience in planning, many irreconcilable problems can be addressed by surgical interventions. It doesn't have to be great big bubbles of single colors. If you do not have a front-to-back discipline, it is going to be very, very difficult to mix the incomes in the way that I'm proposing. By the way, and I'm not proposing that the jumps be this huge. You don't have to jump from high-rises to apartment buildings. You can grade it down slowly from apartment buildings to townhouses to side yard houses to small lot single family to large lot single family. It can be graded imperceptibly. We've done that in all of our developments, and there has never been a marketing problem. Now, in the end, or rather, what I'm going to speak about in the next few slides is how to make a public realm that works for people. You know about this. Normally I need to remind people with slides like this because you have downtown San Antonio. This is in Nantucket. This is a place that people enjoy being in public, meeting each other, etc. It is important for a sense of community that you have a public space. This kind of thing is all too rare in the new cities of suburban sprawl. There's very, very little community feeling. There's a place in Miami called Kendall that has a population of 160,000 people, and there was a kind of scandal. People were asked where they lived, and they didn't know. They didn't know that they existed. They didn't know where they were. There was a complete disorientation as to what community they belonged in. And this is a completely planned area built since the 1970s, all of planned unit developments. It's just astonishing. Now they all have an inferiority complex and so forth, and they're having these completely artificial parades in parking lots, you know, which have to be induced a la Rouse, you know, by egging people on instead of the natural, everyday meeting that takes place when you provide public space. Because in the end, what is important is providing what is called a sense of place. A public realm where you feel that it's okay to be there. Just to be there is okay. It feels okay. What are the ingredients to make this? You know, this sense of place is a really mysterious thing. The National Endowment for the Arts has given lots of studies to achieve, how do you achieve sense of place. Lots of money has been spent on paving and banners and lighting and all that. And yet sense of place is something that any surveyor or any farmer throughout the 19th century was able to achieve without even thinking twice. All the old towns, in fact, have sense of place. It's only where planners are active that sense of place is elusive. And the problem is that it is just too simple to be worthy of professional expertise. And it involves just two elements. The first one is as simple as this room. This is a place because it's a room. This is a room because there are walls. Okay? Whenever buildings make walls, the street feels like a room, and it feels okay to be there. It's a sense of place. Whenever buildings are spinning and shaking and rotating in the desperate and futile attempt to act independently, they destroy the wall and they destroy the ability to make a sense of place. That is why this is a street in Alexandria where people come to. That is why this is a parking lot, which is a sociofugal space where people flee. Sociofugal means people flee, people come out of their cars and go indoors. Sociopetal means it attracts people. People drive for hours to spend an afternoon in a place like this. The way it's done is, well, it's really the architect's fault. The architects have developed a fashion of staggering back and forth as often as the budget will allow. In the attempt to actually establish individuality, but actually just not achieving individuality, but merely destroying the possibility of space. The ingredients are exactly the same. Unit, dwelling unit, landscaping, parking, asphalt, cars. Dwelling unit, landscaping, asphalt, cars. But this adds up to something that is so important to people that people who buy here pay 6 times as much for this box as they will for this box. So if you think that I'm being a bit theoretical now, there is nothing theoretical about people pulling out their wallets and overpaying for these, because that's what happens every time one of these occurs. The paradox or rather the irony is that this actually costs less to build. Because articulating in section like this not only gives you as much individuality as that, but it costs less than articulating in plan. What could be more expensive than all these extra corners and all of these complexities in the roof? Any architect that does not provide for their developer this is really actually doing a developer a disservice, because this costs nothing and it has an extraordinary value, perceived value added to it. All of the towns that we have designed outperform the suburban condition, and the fundamental trick is simply to line the buildings up like that. Now you can't count on the architects doing that. So if you're interested in achieving this, you must code it with build-to lines with a certain discipline. For example, you should have a frontage line, and you must build a minimum of your frontage. You must place a building on your frontage a minimum percentage of the lot width, as opposed to the current code that says, look, as long as you don't build in the front 25 feet, you can do anything you want. You can rotate, you can jump, anything. The traditional codes work differently. You must build up to a line to achieve the sense of place. Now there's another ingredient. The second, I've only given you one ingredient so far. It's very simple. Line up the buildings. The second ingredient, which has been known since the Renaissance, is the height to width ratio. Okay? In order to achieve a sense of place, you cannot exceed the height. The bounding wall is the height. The width between buildings is the width. You cannot exceed a height to width ratio of 1 to 6. If you exceed 1 to 6, the buildings might be lined up, but it doesn't feel like a space. The Renaissance theoreticians preferred 1 to 3, 1 to 3, like this. But 1 to 6 is the maximum. Now, unfortunately, in American suburbia, Americans like their houses low, and they like their front yards wide. So very often, you find that the 1 to 6 ratio has been exceeded, at which point it is necessary to plant trees all in a row. These trees are not there for ornamental reasons. They're there to correct the spatial deficiency of that street, which is too wide. So the first task of the landscape architect is to correct the spatial deficiency of the planner. The second task is to make things pretty. That, unfortunately, is not what landscape architects have been doing. What they've been doing is making things pretty first and then see what happens later. This is an instance, a typical instance. This is downtown Homestead, which is a place that was lacking in sense of place. So they hire a landscape architect. The landscape architect considers it dishonorable to line up more than 2 trees in a row because it's uncreative, and probably he thinks it's unecological. So he has the Everglades move in like this, you know, all these things all over. And then he says, well, this is not working, and nervously he adds brick to it, and finally in desperation he tattoos a flower, you see, on the paving. Now all this photographs very well. This stuff looks good, and that's why landscape architects do it. It looks great, but when you're there, there's no sense of place. There's a big difference between a good-looking public space and a public space that has a sense of place. This is something that should be in the codes also, because as I've said, landscape architects have a tendency to not line up trees. They don't think it's creative enough. If you are going to have picturesque planting, that should be confined to parks. Parks are there to simulate nature. Streets and avenues have another purpose, and it is not to simulate nature. Another perfectly simple reason why we don't have pedestrian life in residential neighborhoods has to do with houses like this. Now, these houses in many ways are okay. They have nice materials, they have nice shapes, the landscaping is good. The problem is that the only information that they're giving is that cars live there. You see? Here the cars live independently. Here the cars are shacked up. But other than that, that is of no great interest except to very recent immigrants who are still fascinated by the business of the cars. And yet, well, take this. This is the alternative in a town that is full of tourists called Stuart, Florida. This architecture is not superior to this one. They're both boxes. The difference is that all the information that this house is giving is about people. People turn the lights on and off. People stand behind windows. People have newspapers here on the stoop. Now, what happens is that humans are a very gregarious species, and they love people and what they do. They watch each other a lot. This house is full of people activity, or potential people activity. This one is not. So you get pedestrian life here, and you don't get pedestrian life here. In fact, I happen to know this is a place called Wellington in Florida, where we're now doing the 1,600-acre extension. The people in Wellington drive to the exercise club where they use the walking machines. That's actually what they do. Now, how is that to be achieved? How can you overcome the problem of the garage when you have a small lot? I mean, after all, if you have a 50-foot lot and you have 2 parked cars, that's taking up 50% of your frontage. No architect can overcome that. It will eat up the frontage. What you need are alleys or lanes like this. The old system of alleys and lanes permits people to park from the rear. That's why the old neighborhoods here in San Antonio look so much better. It's not that the housing is necessarily superior, because it's actually not that different. Some of the new housing looks pretty good. It's just that the old housing is not showing a high percentage of garage doors. So they're automatically, they subconsciously would consider them friendlier. This, not only the cars in the back, but the trash cans in the back are a great asset. And the infrastructure, especially the cables and the pipes. When they're to the rear, you don't have to mangle the trees in front. And even when they're buried, even when the cables are buried, as they often are these days, if they're in the front, they're preventing the planting of trees to occur there, which immediately widens the street. And as you know, or as I said earlier, the narrower the street, the more popular it is. In fact, I have an entire series of slides that show how in every city, the highest real estate value coincides with the narrowest street. It's exactly the opposite of what developers think. It's a remarkable situation. The most elegant shopping street, the most elegant living street in Boston, in San Francisco, in Miami, the narrowest is the one with the highest real estate value. People love space, love tight spaces. Where is the money for lanes or alleys to come from? Well, the suburbs are full of wasted money. Why in the world was this developer forced to build a collector street? Whatever happened to the old system of having a street that had cars and houses on it? Why must this street be built and then this additional street be built also? This is a complete waste of money, which can be used in other ways. Besides, this, by being detailed, having the geometries of a highway, means that people speed. So first they build these high-speed streets, then they put speed bumps to hobble them. You know, why not use the natural system in which the natural narrowness of the street and the parked cars automatically make people go slowly? That's the old economical system. One other detail about this. It is not enough to just require open space. Like many codes have 30% open space. If all you ask is open space, the developers will give you this drivel on the edges, which they don't want anyway, which is perfectly useless. You should define your open space as accurately as you define your parking lots. Open spaces have actually four different categories: squares, greens, parks, and green belts. And each of them has a very precise definition. And they should be as closely coded as parking lots are coded. A square is a very specific animal, which if it is going to be used, it needs to be precisely designed, including it should not have an excessive size. The squares that work best are smaller squares. They have parking and paving requirements, which should be very, very precisely enunciated in a traditional code. Open space, this is really, it's just a maintenance problem, and it really does not form a focus of society. Another aspect which seems to be inoffensive, but it turns out to be of crucial importance, is this mania that planners have now developed for the dead worm street system. Like this. Why is it that this is so important to planners and developers to the extent that, for example, twice we have been summarily fired by developers for doing straight line layouts? Even though every single wonderful city and village in the world has straight streets. And all the boring suburbs in the world have curvilinear ones. All the places we love to visit have straight streets. And yet it is anathema to do it. If you want to waste a lot of money doing these hyper-expensive curvy streets, which in addition to that are completely confusing, The primary experience of being in the suburb in a layout like this is the stress of being lost. There's no way around it. That's what it feels like. You need specific instructions, first left, second right, and if you make the mistake or it's night, you're really in terrible shape. Why is this so important? Well, it's important because it terminates vistas. Apparently, or correctly, people do not like to look down the street and have the vista terminate somewhere in the haze, in the prairie. That is not a satisfactory feeling. And when you curve the street, it actually closes the vista in a systematic manner. In an unthinking manner, it is vaguely pleasant. But it's pleasant in the way that elevator music is pleasant. You can't remember what it does. And that's the problem. There's no system of orientations. Those of you who are planners have read Kevin Lynch's Image of the City, and it talks about how important it is for people to orient themselves, to know where they are by using landmarks. In a layout like this, it is completely impossible to achieve landmarks because the eye never rests on anything. Before the architect can respond, you've been taken away and nothing. You cannot focus on anything. It is not natural, as you can see. In fact, if you want to see how to use the land intelligently and in an ecologically sound manner that is very, very accurate about where the wetlands are and the subtleties, see what the farmers do. Whenever we have studied the layout of farmers, the small deflections and so forth that occur, this is really what the land requires, not this artificial curving. The way landmarks are to be used is not by making curvilinear streets, but by terminating vistas with memorable buildings. Those cities that we remember to be wonderful cities often have their important buildings in important locations. This is Charleston, South Carolina, where this important street ends there. Washington, D.C. is the primary city in the United States in which the vistas are terminated by important buildings, but Annapolis and Williamsburg and many of the Texan and Florida courthouse towns have terminated vistas like that. You have quite a few here in San Antonio when streets deflect. In fact, when you look at an old planning book for up to 1930, there's page after page of intersections that look like this, in which what the book is proposing is all sorts of different ways by which the vista gives a special location so that architects can respond in a memorable way to the vista. Now, we have given, this particular book had over 20 of these. We gave it to our traffic engineer, and the traffic engineer determined that every single one was illegal. We also traveled with our traffic engineer, and he always finds that all of these are illegal. Now, we point out and say, but my dear sir, no one has crashed into this in 150 years, you see. That doesn't matter. It's not in the books. The assumption that is being made is that this, instead of being a narrow street in which cars go slowly by virtue of the parked cars and the smaller dimension, what the engineers assume is that this is a micro highway. And of course, in a standard Department of Transportation section, people will speed and they will hit that church. The drunk at midnight will actually hit that church sooner or later. See, this is not, you can't just do parts of it. You can't have intersections like these unless you at the same time reduce the street sections so that people slow up. It's very dangerous to do traditional urbanism on a partial basis because it tends to explode. You need to have the entire kit of parts. The entire kit of parts works beautifully. Now, this is a very important tool, the termination of vistas, because it means that our civic buildings, which are no longer, we no longer have the model, we no longer have the money to build beautiful civic buildings. You know, we're no longer a rich country. So we build normal, dignified civic buildings, but they can be enormously enhanced by giving them honorable locations at the end of vistas. We just can't operate as planners unless we're permitted to terminate vistas with buildings. What happens is that the art of urban planning is removed from us. We can't act. We can no longer make beautiful cities unless intersections like these are recovered. It's of crucial importance. Another aspect of pedestrian life is only a detail, but it is as important as any other element. Notice that in cities where there's a pedestrian life, the curb radius is relatively small. In this case, in Boston, it's an 8-foot radius. It means that the pedestrian moving down the sidewalk, when that pedestrian arrives at a 24-foot paving, that crossing distance is only 24 feet, which is a doable distance. In the current mode of increasing curb radii, in this case it's a Miami residential neighborhood with 25, what happens is that the pedestrian moving down the sidewalk, instead of just crossing the 24 feet of paving, has to cross 48 feet of paving. Which means that the window of opportunity for crossing, if this one can be crossed, for example, in 7 seconds, this one needs to be crossed in 14 seconds. It needs 14 seconds to cross it. And of course, that instance of the 14-second gap occurs much more seldom than the 7-second gap. And so you tend to have pedestrian life die when this happens. The other thing that happens is that the cars don't have to slow up. This guy is tilting his car making that turn. He's not even touching the brake. What has happened in the United States is that traffic engineering standards, which used to have a full range from 15 miles an hour to 85 or God knows 100 miles an hour, each speed having a whole series of geometrical requirements, centerline radii, curb radii, and so forth. Back in the 1950s or 60s, the whole bottom end of the manual was removed. And we no longer can design streets that are less than 35 miles an hour. That is the fundamental problem that is happening here. And in fact, the push is now still in the other direction. In Miami now, the Public Works Department is proposing 40-foot right-of-ways, which means you can do that easily at 40 miles an hour, perhaps even at 50 for a decent driver. What does 50-mile-an-hour turns have to do with a residential neighborhood? What's happening is that the traffic engineers are considered the solution to our traffic problems, the only solution to our traffic problems, and they're being given an absolutely free hand to make the traffic flow as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible at the expense of other issues, such as public life. They have, at this moment, no natural enemies. So like any predator in that condition, there is nothing to stop them from, in fact, doing more and more of this. Fortunately, I have been asked to lecture tomorrow at the National Convention of the Institute of Traffic Engineers for 3 hours. So, I assure you, it is about the first opposition they will have met in years. They are like gods because, you know, they are considered the solution and the only solution to the problem. What is it like? What are the economic implications of this kind of investment in highways? Here on the left is the illustration on the cover of the annual report of the Florida Department of Transportation. This is obviously what they have in mind for us in Florida. Now, what has been achieved here is something which is extraordinary. They have turned a little old urban four-laner, just a four-lane street going through an urbanized area, into a highway, you know, by these enormous high-speed geometries that have been applied. As a result of this, not only has a lot of land been consumed and a lot of money been consumed, but the real estate value on either side has been actually devastated by the reality of high-speed traffic. All of these things along the edge, in fact, have lower real estate value. Take an alternate model. This is Paris. And I could show you slides of San Francisco or slides of Washington. The difference is, I should go back to this, is that this is a highway and this is an avenue. A highway has a place in the countryside, but whenever a highway enters a city, it should lose its high-speed geometries and become an avenue. An avenue has entirely different requirements. This is an avenue going through a city. Notice that there are 4 high-speed lanes, 2 low-speed lanes, and 6 lines of parking, plus trees, sidewalks, and buildings. And people who consider it perfectly fine to cross and perfectly fine to sit in a cafe and have a nice cup of coffee. This is not a person that considers himself unfortunate to be there. On the contrary, very fortunate to be there. How did Paris pay for its infrastructure? Because Paris was entirely reconstructed in the 19th century without any tax dollars or tax francs or whatever it was they had at the time. The way they did it is by building avenues like these, which were so elegant and so desirable that they increased real estate value on the side. First they condemned land, then they built the avenue, then they sold it to developers, and with the value added they paid for the infrastructure. Not only the streets, but the sewers and the schools. All of that and the new water system was paid for by this system. So instead of destroying real estate value, they enhanced real estate value. Everything that you see here in detail is illegal now. The distance to the tree, the cars parked, This system of the service way with only this much distance between the two, everything here is illegal. You can't do it. Despite the evidence that a city of 11 million people, it works perfectly for them. And these are not some weird Europeans, you know. These are perfectly modern people that know exactly what they're doing. But we're not permitted to do this any longer. We can only do that. What does it do to and how are our intersections handled? Well, this is the old system. This is Washington, D.C. This intersection here has tremendous capacity to distribute traffic. It also has the capacity to make a wonderful park in the center and to make fantastic, elegant building sites that can be sold for a high real estate return. All of this in an area about the same size as this, as 1/4 of a clover leaf. This area that modern traffic engineering requires is 120 acres. That's the size of Renaissance Florence. Every time you see one of these, you know, that's what is being taken out of commission. The amount of wastage that is implied by this is not only the $7 million it costs to build one of these, excluding land acquisition costs. It is the taking out of the land and the reduction of real estate value that occurs all along its edges. All of these units rent for less, and mostly you want to have parking lots on them. It's a fantastically stupid way to do things. You know what you gain? 10 seconds on the way home, in your commute home, as if that mattered when you were commuting an hour and a half anyway. But that's what you gain. You have the pleasure of not even touching your brake as you make that curve. This comes from a period in America when we were so wealthy that we were permitted to be dumb. For 40 years we have done planning, the planning of the rich and the stupid. Now fortunately, we no longer have the money. This is no longer a rich country. You might have noticed that. It happens, there are headlines in the newspaper every day, there's no money for anything. We have now gone back to be a poor country, which is fine because we were a poor country for the first 150 years of our existence. And in those years when we were a poor country, we were smart. This was a poor, smart country. And we used to do things like this. And all we have to do, not feel sorry for ourselves that we're now poor, but simply get smart again. This in many ways was a better world than this one. Some people that suffer, specific people that suffer or benefit from traditional urbanism, police departments benefit. This is one of the great hopeful signs or hopeful interventions in police practice, which is the patrolman on the beat. Washington and New York have instituted this. Instead of responding to crime in patrol cars, policemen are assigned several city blocks and they walk it. And they get to know the people and they can tell that they're able to identify crime before it happens. New York City reported last week in the New York Times that crime had dropped 10% in New York, which is remarkable, and it might have something to do with these people. By the way, the cops like it. They like to do this. This can't be done in cul-de-sacs. It's actually technically impossible to do this. Developers. The most sophisticated developers of Florida are VITA, that get the very best marketing advice, the most expensive, the best, the most thorough marketing advice. What they find time after time after time is that the hometown is what sells real estate. Villages, towns, town centers, neighborhoods, it is these words. If developers deliver this, they have absolutely no problem selling. Other people who suffer, senior citizens. Florida is full of people who have gone to retire in Florida, in suburban neighborhoods or in golf course communities. What they don't realize is that they need to re-retire. Because what happens is that as soon as they lose their driver's license, which happens when their eyes go bad, not when their minds go bad or when they get physically in bad shape, but when their eyes go bad, they can no longer lead an independent existence. And they do two things. They either go back to New Jersey, there's a fantastic out-migration from Florida, where they go back to where they started, or they go into specialized retirement communities, which are dreadful places usually, where everything is taken care of. Wherever traditional neighborhoods exist, gentlemen like this one can get to be very, very old and still live independently because they can get to their daily needs by walking. This is in Country Club Plaza in Kansas City, which is a development which is done like a traditional neighborhood. Wonderfully successful place. The seniors suffer, and they don't properly identify it. By the way, seniors, South Carolina did a study recently, must have been this year, about where people would prefer to retire. 65% wanted to retire to small towns. I don't know how many wanted to retire to golf course communities, but all I can tell you is that of the people who retire in golf course communities, only 27% play golf. And those are the ones within golf course communities. What people really want are towns. They're just not being provided yet by developers. Other people who suffer, and these might be the greatest sufferers of all, are kids. Now this is unexpected because people move to the suburbs thinking that it's going to be good for their kids. In fact, it is good for their kids to have a house and a lot. What's not good is that the kids can't get anywhere without being driven by parents. Everything they need. You give your kid an allowance, the kid has to beg to be driven somewhere to spend it. The kids are delivered to the house at 3 o'clock in the afternoon by the school bus. If you don't want them warehoused in front of the television set, you need one or another of the parent needs to become a chauffeur. That has been the case with my sister in Miami. She was a journalist. She had 2 children. For the last 8 years, she has been a chauffeur. That has been her profession. On weekends, they call parents. Parents call each other to arrange for baseball games. And they have to put up with watching the baseball game for 2 hours so they can drive the kid back and so forth. Whatever happened to the system of the kid walking down to the school and just, picking up a bat and playing baseball? The kids are completely incapacitated as independent beings in suburban conditions. Many people grew up in neighborhoods like this, where kids in neighborhoods. There's still a great memory in the United States of that. And they come up to me after the lectures and they confirm that it was wonderful when in fact they could get to school, they could get to the corner store, they could get to the movies. That is quickly disappearing. And there are kids that were actually, that led 2 lives, that grew up in a neighborhood and then at 13 or 14 they were taken out to the suburbs, and they come to me and say, now I understand why I became an unhappy person at 14. It wasn't puberty, it was the inability to actually have any freedom. Why is it? Why is it? This is not a concentration camp here. This is a school. This is a school in Orlando. We're currently providing schools that are wooden barracks with air conditioning backpacks and chain link fences. This is a normative school now in the very wealthy state of Florida. How have we reached this situation in which now, in our wealthiest years, we build public buildings that look like this, when in the 30s and 40s and the 1890s and the 1870s and the 1860s and the 1810s, we used to build magnificent public buildings for our kids and for ourselves? What we have done is we have reallotted the budget that we have, the public purse that is spent on infrastructure, away from vertical infrastructure that people can use towards horizontal infrastructure that only cars can use. It's not that we're poorer. It's just that we're building gold-plated highways. Nothing but the best for our cars. Every year the standards get more generous for the cars. The lanes get wider. The centerline radii get more generous and so forth. While for the schools, we become progressively accustomed to nothing but the worst for our kids. That must be affecting society in a serious way. We can't afford daycare centers, but we have budgets of billions for highways. Right now, this country, President Bush has committed us to additional billions for highways. There are states like Florida where the highway department budget approaches or exceeds the education department budget, despite the absolute futility of building highways. Because as I've said earlier, very early on in the talk, it doesn't solve the traffic problem. In fact, let me quote a report from Los Angeles. The Southern California Association of Governments, Los Angeles and its attendant communities, completed a computer model of the year 2015 in which they modeled every possible alternative for traffic, including double-decking highways, buying additional right-of-way, mandatory staggering of work hours, subsidizing of public transit. Their conclusion was, nothing that can feasibly be done will have any but a cosmetic effect on the problem except for mixed-use planning. Cosmetic being, that's only a temporary solution. So any and all money spent on building highways, as opposed to roads and streets, which are necessary, but on building highways, is absolutely down the barrel. Now, for many years, we were able to afford that. We were able to afford the illusion that we could do that and also do this, but that's no longer the case. And you should fight this with all the energy that you have, because it's really wasting your treasure. One last individual type of person that suffers from, this says from before dawn to after dark, traffic governs Prince William family. These people, if you read this, actually don't have 8-hour work days, they have 11-hour work days. because of when you factor in the commuting, we're right back to the standards before of the Industrial Revolution. See, we think we work 8 hours, but we have to commit 1 hour on either side to something that is actually much more stressful than even the work usually, which is the commute. What the middle class does, and the middle class in suburban sprawl is perfectly accustomed to commuting an hour to work and an hour back. What the middle class does by spending those extra hours is that their quality of life drops drastically. Not their standard of living. The standard of living in terms of square footage and washing machines is perfect. The quality of life is very low. Because if you commute 1 hour a day to work and 1 hour back, you're spending 8 weeks in the car. So you can add those 8 weeks to your 2-week vacation and you can see what that does to your quality of life. It's devastating. You can also calculate the quality of life of your children. If you commute 1 hour a day over and back, by the time your child is 18, you will have spent 3 years in the car. 3 years of high quality time with your children. Not at night, but good daytime hours that cannot be spent with your kids. It's absolutely astonishing. And you can add to that the quality of life of the poor. Do you know that owning a car in the United States costs $5,000 a year? That $5,000 a year can sustain a $50,000 mortgage. There is nothing that you can do in terms of making housing cheaper that can make a bigger dent in affordable housing than permitting a family to own 1 car less. In other words, to own just 1 car instead of 2 or 2 instead of 3, because that's $50,000. And that isn't a theoretical number. It's what the bankers call a back ratio. See, when you apply for a mortgage loan, the front ratio is the amount you're asking for relative to your income. The back ratio is the amount that you're asking for relative to all your debts. And bankers, for example, in Florida have told me that they often have to require people to sell cars before they qualify for mortgages, because they can't. And what people do is, in fact, they sell the car, then they go right around and buy it back again after they're qualifying. But the bankers aren't wrong. Those people, in fact, cannot afford the cars. And they're up to here in debt, holding 2 jobs, husband and wife working, weekends being busy. It's the most fantastically low quality of life that you can imagine to be in the lower middle class in the suburb. It is much worse than any Italian with 1/3 the income might experience. I don't think really that as a people we deserve this rotten deal that is being presented as the American dream. And it is being all the illusions that the marketing people, that the developers, the television, everything is actually selling this to the American citizen, and very few people are providing the alternative. But the instant the alternative is provided and understood, they flock to it. In fact, the problem we have with all of our towns, the ones that are being built, is that even the small units become unaffordable because there's such a desirability to live in this kind of community. The experience of Florida and the prospect of planning in Florida is really quite depressing. We're beginning now to enter a cycle of planning in which, if everything goes very well, an entire generation of planners will have the capability of spending billions of dollars, and in the end, what we will look back upon in the year 2010 is that the driving time has been restrained to 40 minutes or to 30 minutes. That's all. That is really what's in the books now. That's what concurrency, the only thing that concurrency is worrying about is traffic driving time. That is really unworthy of our capabilities and of our energies and of our political will. What we should be worrying about is the restoring of communities like this. Everything that is in this photograph, in this old photograph, the types and quality of buildings, how they're assembled, the street and what it's like, the gathering of people of different ages and different incomes, the fantastic feeling of community which is evident here. This is the human habitat. This is what we should in fact be instituting in our codes and be worrying about in our planning. There is a great deal of distraction going on now towards traffic movement and the ecological movement. A lot of energy is being spent in the safeguarding of wetlands, which is a wonderful thing to do and very useful, but the same energy should be applied in the safeguarding of the human habitat. And that's really what I've been talking about today. Now, I have simplified things somewhat. I can speak easily for another hour more talking about the technicalities of traffic and how they go through neighborhoods and so forth, but very few people can stand that much in one especially after lunch. Because this, in the end, is quite a depressing analysis, isn't it?